Here's the thing. Nobody tells you the truth about prehistoric life. The cold, dark cave, the sharpened spear, the mammoth hunt, the constant, grinding, terrifying fight to just open your eyes from one sunrise to the next. That is the image most people carry around in their heads when they think about our ancient ancestors. Young, powerful, fast, moving through a world that had absolutely zero patience for weakness. A world where the moment your knees started to give out, the moment your eyes blurred, the moment you could not keep pace with the pack across a frozen plain, that was it. Nature collected its debt. You were done. So here's the question that should be genuinely bothering you right now. How did old people survive? Not for a week, not by pure dumb luck on one specific afternoon, but consistently, repeatedly, long enough that we have fossil records of elderly humans scattered across prehistoric camps all over the earth. People with bones worn down by severe arthritis, multiple snapped and healed fractures, teeth ground down completely flat against the gum line, visibly ruined joints, living well into their 40s, 50s, and in a shocking number of documented cases, their 60s and 70s, in a world without a single hospital, without antibiotics, without surgery, without a pharmacy within 10,000 years of being invented, without anything even close to a retirement plan. These people were old, genuinely, physically, visibly old. And they were alive how? First, we need to kill a myth, one that has survived much longer than it deserves. You have definitely heard this claim before. People back then only lived to be 25. It gets repeated constantly in short documentaries by confident people at dinner parties using it to settle arguments about modern progress. And looking at the raw numbers, they seem right. The average life expectancy for ancient populations sits right around 30 to 35 years. So, case closed, right? Completely embarrassingly wrong. Because that number is an average. And averages in the ancient world are dragged straight into the dirt by a brutal math trick: child mortality. Long before cities existed, anywhere from 30 to 45% of kids died before turning 15. The vast majority of them never even saw their 5th birthday. Basic infections that a cheap pill cures today. Parasites, animal attacks, accidents, slipping and falling into rivers, starving when a bad season ran too long. Sicknesses we wipe out with simple infant shots today, filled baby graves in massive, staggering numbers. When you fold that tidal wave of early graves into your final math, you get a fake picture. It creates a number that makes it look like everyone just dropped dead at 30. But that is not what happened. What actually happened was that early childhood was an unimaginably brutal meat grinder. And the kids who actually survived the childhood meat grinder stepped into adulthood holding something else entirely. Hardened immune systems, razor-sharp survival skills, bodies built like iron, perfectly capable of dragging them a very long way into the future. Researchers Michael Gervin and Hillard Kaplan cracked the code on this. They looked at the skeletal data and found a truth that completely destroys the popular story. If you made it to your 15th birthday, your real finish line was not 30. It was anywhere between 68 and 78 years old. That is not the average math trick. That is the most common age of death for the people who actually beat the terrible odds of childhood. That specific number tells you the true story of the survivors. Stop and really think about that for a second. 68 to 78 years old, surviving for 7 decades with 0 pharmacies in the entire world. No antibiotics, no blood pressure pills, no reading glasses, no hearing aids, no ergonomic chairs to catch your tired spine. Getting to 70 today takes a massive safety net of doctors and machines. They hit 70 using nothing but flesh, bone, and grit. What did hitting 70 actually look like in a landscape packed with active predators, raging diseases, and brutal winter starvation? Your whole world was a tiny tribe of maybe 25 to 50 people. Every single person had to pull their own weight every single day. So what could you possibly offer them when the fast speed and the raw physical firepower of your youth had finally burned out? You offered the one thing nobody else had: something that could never be faked, purchased, or quickly thrown together. We forget this harsh reality today. We completely offloaded the heavy job of remembering to books. Then to search engines. Now, you just ask AI. But imagine a prehistoric world, completely blind and deaf without them. No ink, no paper, minds acting as the only hard drives. No way to keep a single thought alive outside the fragile human skull. In that brutal reality, old people were the flesh and blood search engines. The entire accumulated survival manual of the tribe lived in exactly one place. Behind the wrinkled eyes of the few people who had lived long enough to map it out. Every tested rule for staying alive existed strictly inside their aging minds. Where to find hidden water when the usual rivers turned to dust. Which green leaves stopped a raging fever. Dodging poisonous leaves that caused violent stomach cramps. Which crushed roots, packed into an open wound, stopped the dark rot that killed you in a week. Reading red skies, feeling the wind shift, watching the animals to predict a massive storm 3 days before it hit, fixing crushed legs, setting a snapped bone so you could actually walk again instead of crawling. Which exact path to take when winter hit early. How many days of walking it took to cross that frozen rock. What nightmares waited at the end of that trail. How the prey moved when the earth dried up. What the tribe did the last time the world fell apart. None of this was written down. It lived entirely inside human memory. It moved through the only technology capable of carrying it. Voices by the fire, deliberate, repeated. Survival stories passed from the ones who knew down to the ones who needed to know. A fragile chain of life with absolutely no backup system. If the elders died, the knowledge died. That is what these ancient people carried in their heads every single morning. It made them urgently, desperately valuable. An elder who survived 60 years of frozen winters, failed hunts, and bloody diseases was not a dead weight dragging the tribe down. They were the ultimate survival machine. A walking library, a weather station, a battlefield surgeon, all bundled into one breathing body, sitting quietly next to the fire. Consider the Hadza people of northern Tanzania. They are one of the last remaining tribes living exactly like our ancient ancestors. When researchers lived with a Hadza band in the 1980s, they saw something completely unexpected. The older women whose bodies had permanently shut down the ability to create babies. They were the hardest workers in the entire camp. They worked more hours than the young girls. They spent their days digging roots. They pulled more food out of the dirt and fed more starving kids than almost anyone else. This sparked a massive scientific earthquake. The grandmother hypothesis. The core rule is simple. Menopause is not a broken machine. It is not your body giving up halfway through the race. It is cold, brilliant biological math. It is a deliberate trade. These older women stopped making new babies to protect the ones already breathing. Their grandchildren. By digging roots, feeding the young, and taking over the heavy lifting of childcare, they freed up their daughters to have more kids faster. Grandmothers were trading wombs for wisdom. In brutal evolutionary math, their DNA wins. Not by having more babies, but by keeping the current ones alive. The numbers prove it everywhere. Kids with living, active grandmothers simply do not die as often. The effect is absolute. But here's the massive truth hiding right underneath that theory. The grandmother hypothesis does not just explain why menopause happens. Kristen Hawkes at the University of Utah spent decades defending a much larger idea. She argues this actually explains why humans live so long in the first place. It triggered a deep biological loop. The longer a grandmother stayed alive, the more her grandchildren survived. Tribes packed with active working grandmothers possessed a massive advantage over tribes left without them. It became a genetic lottery won by grandmothers. The specific genes causing slower aging spread aggressively through the bloodlines. Women carrying those tough, slow aging genes simply produced more living descendants. Over deep time, across thousands of generations of this invisible pressure accumulating, this relentless cycle forced a physical change. It stretched human life like a rubber band. It did not just delay death for older women. It stretched the total lifespan for our entire species. The very reason you have the luxury of expecting a long life today is because ancient women stayed alive to feed their grandchildren. Their sacrifice permanently hacked our biology. Now, let's look at Shanidar 1. Everything we just talked about is just data and broad theory. Shanidar 1 makes it violent, personal, and genuinely stunning. In 1957, archaeologists were digging through the dirt in northern Iraq. They found a cave once used by Neanderthals, our closest ancient cousins, a group that hunted alongside modern humans before vanishing into the earth around 40,000 years ago. The team pulled multiple skeletons from the dirt, but one of them completely broke the mold. The bones belonged to a Neanderthal male. They called him Shanidar 1. He died somewhere between 35 and 45 years old. For a Neanderthal walking through the Pleistocene, that is incredibly old. But his age is the least shocking thing about him. Very early in his life, Shanidar 1 took a massive, crushing blow to the left side of his face. His skull was smashed. The hit was so brutal, it blinded his left eye permanently. The damage cascaded. It paralyzed the right side of his body. His right arm was a dead, shriveled thing. The bone was thin and useless, likely completely severed above the elbow. He also carried a badly snapped right foot, a healed fracture that forced him into a permanent, painful limp. Later tests on his skull revealed massive bone blockages in his ears. The world had gone completely quiet and dark. So, count the damage. One working arm, half blind, completely deaf, limping through monster territory. He was trapped in a small, hungry tribe, hunting massive beasts across frozen rock. And he lived with all of this for 10 to 15 years. His body carried the old scars. He survived the initial shock. His bones knit back together, and he kept breathing. Archaeologist Penny Spikins looked at these bones and laid down the cold truth. He was totally useless. He could not throw a spear. He could not run. He was a dead weight, and yet his tribe kept him alive for over 10 brutal years. That is not an accident. That is not a blind, deaf man, somehow scraping by alone in a dark cave while his people moved on. The bones tell a very different truth. He was a dead weight in a starving world, but he was being fed. He was being physically carried across jagged rocks. He was being managed deliberately by people who had every excuse to leave him behind. They chose not to. In a tiny camp where every single piece of meat mattered, feeding a man who couldn't throw a spear was a massive, dangerous sacrifice. It was a heavy choice made by a hungry tribe. They burned their own precious energy to keep this shattered man breathing. Shanidar 1 is not some isolated ancient miracle. He is simply the most dramatic example. The frozen dirt holds more of them. La Pharisee 1. La Chapelle aux Saints. Skeletons pulled from completely different ages and geographic places. They all repeat the exact same physical pattern. Shattered legs, perfectly healed. Crushing bone diseases actively managed over long, unforgiving years. Individuals who should have bled out or starved within days, somehow surviving for years. Their survival demanded massive, constant, deliberate care from others. We do not have a gentle word for what Neanderthals were doing deep in the ancient world, but it deserves to be called exactly what it was. They were practicing raw medicine without clean rooms. They looked at people who were bleeding and suffering, and they deliberately worked to save them. The proof is locked right inside their skulls. Fossilized teeth hiding secrets. When researchers scraped the hardened dirt off Neanderthal teeth across multiple ancient camps, they found chemical ghosts, traces of specific green plants. Plants that provide absolutely zero food value, but they carry massive medicinal power. Yarrow, groundsel, ifdra, weeds packed with natural chemicals that kill bacteria, crush raging fevers, and numb agonizing pain. These are the exact same wild plants that show up in traditional healing systems all over the planet, used by isolated tribes that never even met each other. So two things are possible here. Either a bleeding Neanderthal was deliberately chewing pain, killing weeds to survive, or someone else in the camp was actively feeding the weeds to them. Either way, the brutal truth remains. The specific knowledge of exactly which wild leaf fixed a dying body was present. And knowledge like that does not just fall from the sky. It is gathered, tested, and passed down by exactly the kind of people we have been talking about. The gray-haired survivors who had watched sickness rip through the camp before and learned exactly how to stop it. Which brings us to the exact moment the world caught fire. Around 30,000 years ago, a sudden, massive shift hit the ancient human population. Researchers studied fossilized teeth across 4 distinct eras of human history, carefully separating the young remains from the old. For hundreds of thousands of years, survival into true old age crept upward very slowly. But then, right at the 30,000-year mark, that slow creep completely vanished. It became a sudden flood of gray hair. The jump was massive and violent in geological time. Far more people were living long enough to grow genuinely old than at any previous point in the human fossil record. So what happened immediately after this massive demographic explosion? The dirt below us literally lights up. Cave walls exploding with breathtaking art. People suddenly burying the dead with deep respect and physical offerings. A massive chain reaction of human brilliance. Networks moving rare stones, hundreds of miles across frozen plains. Highly specialized killing tools replacing crude rocks. Carved bone flutes. Personal jewelry. The full package of complex human culture appears in the dirt at the exact same moment we see this massive spike in old people staying alive. The scientists behind this discovery drew a hard, unbreakable line. This is absolutely not a coincidence. A tribe packed with more old people simply held more accumulated knowledge. More survival knowledge directly created better resource decisions. Better decisions meant far more children beat the brutal, deadly odds of the ancient world. Surviving children built larger, stronger, and incredibly stable populations. Larger tribes splintered, specialized, and traded with neighbors. More contact between competing tribes meant rapid, explosive innovations spreading everywhere. The absolute cultural explosion of our species was not triggered by some random, sudden genetic upgrade in human intelligence. The human brain did not suddenly mutate. It was triggered by simple demographics. We finally put enough experienced, gray-haired survivors around the fire. Old people were never just useless passengers dragging along in the back of the human story. They were the engine pushing the entire species forward. And the human body, it turns out, was deliberately wired for this harsh reality from the very beginning. The aging human brain does not just slowly rot away into uselessness. Yes, the physical processing speed slows down. Raw reaction times drop. Fast memory recall dulls. You get slow muscles. But other critical functions explode. Pattern recognition built from decades of bleeding and surviving. Cold contextual judgment in truly chaotic, deadly situations. Emotional control under crushing pressure. The rare ability to look at a blinding blizzard, connect the dots to a similar storm 30 years ago, and retrieve the exact memory of how the tribe survived it. These mental weapons lock into place and actually sharpen as you age. The aging brain is custom-built for the exact decisions that kept ancient tribes breathing. You do not need fast reflexes when deciding which mountain pass to take before winter traps you. You just need to be absolutely right. They were the steering wheel, not the baggage. Being consistently right in a dark, unpredictable world is exactly what older minds do best. Add all of this up. Add the iron immune systems that allowed smashed men like Shanidar 1 to beat raw infections without doctors. Add the brutal biological math of menopause, pushing older women to trade new babies for the survival of their grandchildren. Add the chemical secrets of pain-killing weeds locked strictly inside elder memory. Add the spoken stories passing weather patterns down a fragile human chain. Add the desperate tribal choices to feed broken bodies just to keep those minds alive. None of this happened alone. These tactics locked together, stacked, and forced human evolution forward over hundreds of thousands of years. The result was a creature where growing old was the ultimate weapon. The people carrying the deepest scars were the exact people the tribe desperately needed to protect. Shanidar 1 was kept breathing for a decade with a dead arm. The Hadza grandmothers dug roots harder than anyone. Australian elders carried the terrifying details of a volcanic eruption across 10,000 years of pure oral memory, saving 400 generations. Ancient survival is a massive interlocking machine, stacking generations. A tight loop of survival. Old people lived because their tribes made heavy choices to feed them. Tribes made those choices because a gray-haired mind could not be replaced by anything else. That absolute irreplaceability forced tribes to protect their elders. Protecting elders stretched human DNA to live longer. Humans living longer stacked more knowledge. The loop pulled tighter until 30,000 years ago, when the pressure cracked the world open and culture exploded. There's a fake story we tell today where old age is just a waiting room for death, where your bones snap and the world forgets you. And then there's the violent, beautiful truth. Old age wasn't the grave. It was the crown, the ultimate destination. If you were tough enough and loved enough, you made it there. And then you spent decades pouring your fortune back into the bloodline that kept you alive. You were never the burden, you were the whole point.